So hi and welcome back. All these presentations are coming fast and furious today. So we're delighted to welcome Eric Say, creative director himself. He's going to be telling you a bit more about him and his company. He runs the company, motion graphic design, animation, all the above.
Broadcast, creative agency, the whole. We'll give you the full.
Fantastic, excellent. And Eric's going to be talking about the connection between Cinema 4D and After Effects, and may mention Cineware, but has got some amazing, yes, along the way, but got some amazing composition and compositing tricks and EXR stuff. So if you use that workflow, absolutely, please take good attention of what Eric's got coming up. So over to you, Eric.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Great to be here. Excited as always to speak. Huge shout out to Maxon for having me. I love being a part of the community. It means the world to me that I get to speak to you guys. So for those of you guys who don't know me, I'm Eric Say. I'm the owner and creative director of Game Day Creative. We are a broadcast motion graphics creative agency. We specialize in sports graphics for television. I'll play my demo reel and you'll get a good idea of what we do. As loud as possible.
Give me that cheddar, we getting Rico. Big bunny rolls like burritos. Give me that hot sauce, no pico. Give me that, give me that. Give me that.
I can't tell you how much it means to me that the song for our demo reel has to do with more cheese. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good idea of what we do, the kind of graphics that we make. Actually here, hi, I'm Eric. But as you can see, we work a lot in the broadcast TV space. A lot of television graphics, particularly in sports. And with that, a lot of our focus is on production, pipeline, efficiency. We produce large volumes of design systems. So when we make these graphics, it's not just one version, it's thousands of versions of them. So actually one thing I'd like to do before I dive into some of that pipeline and efficiency stuff, I just love the opportunity when I get to meet with the community and talk to artists about sort of maybe some of the status quo and what's happening in the motion graphics industry and what's up with being a 3D artist. And of course, this all comes from the perspective as us as a broadcast company. So one good thing is it's a very good time to be a C4D artist. It's a very, very good time. One, you're super employable. People are looking for motion graphics left, right, and center. The demand for video content is only going up. You know, menu boards at McDonald's are now video driven. Your train ticket for Amtrak has an animation to it. Every piece of our world is becoming animated. I think it gets even more exciting being a 3D artist because you have one of the largest companies in the world rebranding and announcing that they're focusing on this metaverse, which is like this AR, VR experience. In my world, virtual sets are becoming incredibly popular for all the reasons. And I think that's a really exciting time as a 3D artist because we're going to be the architects who get to create these new VR and AR worlds. I think it's pretty cool because like city planners and architects and engineers in the past had to worry about things like gravity and cost of materials. And when we go to create these sort of futuristic virtual spaces, anything's the limit. So you picked a very good career. If you're a 3D motion graphics artist, you made a good choice. For our company personally and our pipeline and workflow, some things that are becoming truer and truer is asset packs are everything. We very rarely model our own models. The libraries are good. And that's not to say you don't know, you still need to know how to modify those models and how to customize them. But from an efficiency standpoint, it's quicker to start with a base. If you're going to do a stapler animation, there is 500 staplers on TurboSquid. Don't model that yourself. And the same is true for asset libraries, material libraries. Our friends at Grayscale Gorilla have some really great stuff. Maxon is continuing to expand their asset library, and it's more efficient. So I do know that there's something incredibly rewarding as an artist to like sit in and dial in a texture and noodle with it. And you definitely need to know how to manipulate those handles and how to get into the node editor. But for just look development and creativity and proof of concept, it's faster to just grab from these libraries and mix and match until you get it close. And that's where a bulk of the time is spent, is just, you know, getting the general look and feel. So those are two big trends we find, is we're leaning more and more on asset packs to get us started, and then we go in and highly customize, which I find really rewarding because I feel like we get to focus more on the creativity and the final product and the look and feel and the motion, which is pretty exciting. Is there anything else that I need to touch on that's super relevant? There's a lot of integration to pipeline, so between converting files and speaking to Unreal, it's good to know those things. But more than anything, it's a really good time to be a 3D artist. So if you pick this profession, congratulations. So with that, I guess we can kind of get into what I'd like to talk about today, which is we're going to talk about C4D to After Effects. And in particular, what I'm going to speak about is AOVs and a lot about multi-passes. There's a lot of potential there, there's a lot of power there, and I think I can show you some really good compositing techniques to use those AOVs quickly and efficiently, particularly for look development. So I can open up one little side note. When I was thinking about doing this, I was originally going to try and show some techniques to use standard render passes. That's actually another thing that's sort of relevant in the industry for us today. If we're hiring an artist, and they say, hey, I only know standard render and physical render, that's actually kind of a red flag at this point. It's GPU, that's the future. The Octane, Redshift, V-Ray, we're not a VFX house, but you know, the higher end renders are what everything's trending towards. You get beautiful results, they're fast. Long way of saying, if you don't know Redshift, learn it. Us as a company decided to embrace Redshift because Maxon decided to embrace Redshift, you know, the acquisition, and they're gonna bring their expertise and ease of use to it, which we've already seen and has been working out pretty well. So, with that, let's get into what I wanted to talk about today. So, I think it's this project. And actually, sorry, one last thing before I dive into this project. I forgot. On graphic trends, part of that's important for us as companies to keep an eye out on like where the graphics are heading. And I just like to speculate on this, and this is just really fun for me. But there's kind of been this formula in graphics that big 3D, like really high-end 3D renders meets good typography. Let's see if I can find, yeah, that actually right there. So big 3D render meets editorial typography equals graphics package. And I think by the very virtue that we can identify that trend kind of means it's on the way out. And I think if I was a betting man and I had to speculate about where things are headed, I think we're headed towards more simulation, hyper-realistic graphics packages. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the future. So hopefully you guys are paying attention to EJ, because I think that simulation stuff is really going to start to take hold. And I think that's by virtue of the barrier to entry coming down. It's much easier for people to access simulation software and to produce these things, and it's now becoming possible for graphics pipelines to incorporate that. Plus, this stuff looks really cool. So, you know, things like cloth dynamics and particle simulations and stuff, but a lot of that hyper-realistic stuff where it's photoreal textures meets really cool fluid dynamics and stuff. I think that's gonna be big in the next few years. Anyway, all right, so let's get into this. So the project I want to talk about today is this one. So this is a sports motion graphics package that I won't play the full reel that our team put together a year or so ago. And it's for the road to the World Cup, Copa do Mundial, for Telemundo. And I'll just give you a little bit about some of the design decisions that went into this package and how we got there. We were trying to come up with a look that captured football and felt appropriate, you know, for a celebratory tournament and big things like that. And, you know, some of the iconic things are, of course, the soccer ball itself and some textures and stuff. And as we were looking at soccer balls, we originally, let's see if I can find the frame, explored some stuff with the old-fashioned hexagon, the black and white hexagon we all know and love from soccer balls. I'm not going to be able to find the frame now. But it turns out a soccer ball hasn't been a black and white hexagon for a decade. So as we really started to look at like the shapes and forms appropriate, the modern soccer balls are these curved, flowing shapes with like rounded edges and stuff. We thought that they were iconic in their own nature, and each, of course, tournament has its own ball, but we thought we could capture the essence of that. We also chose to pair that with cloth. cloth was a pretty intuitive answer for a couple of reasons. One, you get some really rich materials with it. There's great motion that comes with cloth. Also, sports has a cloth precedence in their jerseys. And finally, for a multinational tournament, it makes a lot of sense since flags are the way that we represent nationality. So there's a bunch of reasons we went with cloth. So this frame's probably a good summary of the direction we decided to go, where we have this flowing soccer ball hard geometry form contrasted by cloth. Now, unlike EJ's presentation and what I just said, this was done actually without any cloth simulation. We did all of this with displacers, which can get you so far. And for the look that we were trying to do, this worked. But I do think if I was to do this package over again, this would be hyper-simulated cloth. So with that, we started to look into what we wanted the cloth to feel like and what we wanted it to look like, and that's where some of this AOV and compositing stuff came up. And when we originally set out, we wanted super detailed high-end cloth, and we're like, let's use displacements. Let's actually displace this cloth to put these patches on there and make it super high-end. We later found out as we got into the pipeline of that we needed a solution to do cloth displacement in After Effects, which I'll get into later, but at least for now, we'll start with the super high-end, and we can show you how we achieve some of that. So let me open up the file that generated that frame. Cool. So like I said, all of this was done with Redshift. So I'll fire up the Redshift render view here, and we can get a pretty good look at what this is. See how fast this computer is. Cool. So you can see it's got we do both countries, and we render this out and then split it in After Effects to make all the possible iterations. And if I come in here, I crash zoom in on this stitching, you can see that the cloth indeed did a pretty good job of the displacement did a pretty good job of simulating the cloth. And from the viewing distance we were going for, this kind of extra tessellation coming from the displacement map was fine. It looked like sort of thick stitching, so it felt good for where we're at. But one thing we knew we wanted to achieve with this cloth look was something that was tactile. And for me, a really big bar for successful graphics is if I can look at that graphic and know what it would feel like if I reached out and touched it. That's like a good just level of success for a C4D. So we wanted a tactile cloth where I knew what it'd feel like if you touched it. So I want to show you this shader tree. One, because there's one cool AOV technique in here, but also just because there's a couple little cool Redshift tricks. This is the older shader tree, but all this is still relevant. So it's a complex shader tree. I'll walk through it and kind of show you how we got to this final cloth look. But if I start at the top here, there's a Fresnel. And the reason I wanted to talk about this in particular is this is one of my favorite visual effects, stylization tools. So a Fresnel is reflectivity based on viewing angle. A good way to describe that would be if you're like at a pet store and you're looking in the window, you're standing straight at the window and you see the puppy in the window, fine. You can see through the glass. If you were to walk up to that window and lay your face against the glass and look along the glass, you would only see reflection. And as you straighten back out, it transitions back to transparent. That's what a Fresnel generates. It's transparency based on luminance based on viewing angle. What that means for this project, though, is when you port it into something like cloth, it adds sheens to part where it bubbles. Actually, I think I have this, yeah. So you can kind of see it on the top here where we start to get these ripples. They have that little extra brightness and shine to it that sort of helps simulate like that there's fuzz on the cloth or that there's some sort of glow there. It makes it a little more realistic. It's also just a cool stylistic technique. So cool, that's the Fresnel. The rest of this material's pretty standard, but I'll run through it quick. We port that Fresnel into a ramp, and this just allows us to adjust the strength of that Fresnel on the fly very easily. That goes into a texture channel. This texture channel goes into color correction to up its contrast. That goes into a color mode to make it blue, and that goes into kind of the hero Redshift material. There's also a roughness being ported into the reflections and a normals being ported into the bump, but a pretty standard material build. I think if you were to extract a substance shader, you would get something similar to this. From here, it goes into a material blender. And what this is doing is, one, it's taking the color from the US flag and putting it into a part that is dictated by these two mask layers. These two mask layers are also driving the displacement. So those are being ported into displacement channels, which then go into a displacement blender so that the stitching is stronger, has a stronger displace than the body. However, there is something that's happening that's pretty cool here. That is this store AOVs to color. And I think this is just a really powerful AOV output node. So what this does is it takes whatever you port into it and it creates a custom AOV for it. So you get an object buffer for that. And in this case, we're taking this USA matte and creating an object buffer for it. So if I come back to my Redshift render view Switch this to bucket render and go to country fill. You can see that it creates a buffer for just that country, and that allows us to dial in the country colors and the outline colors really rapidly in post. But what's awesome about this store color too is you can take any part of your shader tree and port it into that and get a custom AOV out of it. So if I was to take this this khaki texture, and put it into that AOV output, then we come back over here and give it a second to re-render, we can see now it's just sending out that khaki texture as the AOV. But you can do this at any step and at any level of blending. So you can do scratches, you can do paints, you can do your bumps, and it really allows you to make some custom AOVs. It's super easy to add this. It's under Utilities, AOV, Store Color to AOV. If you drop this in, you put something in it and you just set this new custom AOV. Let's just call this Maxon. If I come to my AOV manager, not what I wanted. Try that again. If I come to my AOV manager, it just adds it and it just works. So it'll just spit it out. And that's all you have to do to set it up. And we found that gave us a lot of handles. So anyway, couple cool little shader tree techniques. But that actually is a good segue to kind of the meat of what I wanted to talk about, which is actually kind of just AOVs and compositing in general. So the AOV manager is, our multi-pass output. This project has puzzle mats, which are completely out of date. Crypto mats are the future. We don't need these whatsoever. I'll touch on that in a minute, so we can just delete those. However, when we go to create a 3D project and we're going to build a scene, especially when we're doing look development, we tend to spit out every AOV we can because we never quite know what information is going to be captured or what information we're going to want in our final look. So we just kind of load them all up in here. When we get to final renders, we'll thin those down to the AOVs that are actually being used just to save on file size. But I pretty much load up every AOV. Some ones that I never miss, I always put shadows in there. I always put specular lighting. I always put reflections. If I'm using emissions, I'll definitely put that in there. And I like a beauty pass as well. And crypto mats. And that just gives you a ton of different outputs that allows you to mix and match in compositing. So I just load up all of these and spit them out. And then I can show you kind of what we do with these AOVs once we get there. So let me open up the compositing file here. Master build. Cool. Don't worry about the missing fonts or the missing plugins. So just give you a quick rundown of how this file is set up for After Effects build once it loads in. We have both teams here, and again, we build them one at a time and split them in After Effects, so there's a full canvas of Jamaica. This gets dropped into a comp that has all the top level text, the depth of field blur, and then this gets dropped into the color correction comp. And this is where all the compositing happens. So I'm just going to run you through my compositing technique. And I'm just going to start at the bottom and solo my way up until we kind of get a good view of all the different layers. So one of my favorite compositing tricks of all time is to take your beauty pass and duplicate it and then use a blending mode with it back upon itself. So usually starting with overlay. And you can just see just by putting overlay on top of this beauty pass, we instantly up the contrast. And what overlaying something on top of itself will do, it'll make your whites whiter, your darks darker, and your colors more saturated. So I almost do this immediately, and then I rate the opacity to just kind of get an idea of how much contrast and the general look and feel I want to go. I also will check out some of the other blending modes just to see if there's anything cool happening. And this is just kind of the exploration to see what is the final look I want. Add is a great one to make something brighter. Screen makes something brighter without the blowout, and multiply is a really good one for darkening. But of course, you could just cycle through all of these and see what kind of results you got. Multiply actually looks pretty cool as well. Anyway, for this particular final product, we actually brightened the scene a little. We did a screen pass with looks like 25% opacity just to bring up the brightness overall. The next compositing layer we did here, and actually for what it's worth, I'd probably, if I was doing this from the fresh, I would dump all of the AOVs in here and just try and blend them in different ways. I'd see what shadows look like on overlay. I'd see what reflections look like on overlay. I'd see what reflections look like on add, and just to see if there's some cool results, what kind of information got spit out in my AOVs. I would come here and tour through these and be like, okay, what information was stored in the reflection pass? What sort of pieces do I want to highlight? And usually in my mind, I kind of have an idea of the look we want to get it to, so this is just a quick way to get through look dev. Anyway, the next one is, actually I need the, if effects controls here, is this exposure tab, which, funny enough, the exposure turns off its levels. We're just pulling off this clipping going on the top with this. We'll add that detail back in with another pass. The next layer is a shadow pass. And this one I definitely want to talk about for sure because it's just masked into this gutter. So all it's doing is increasing that shadow in that center gutter. But why I wanted to talk about this is I think masks are something that people sleep on a lot for a compositing technique. You know how long it would take in cinema to position area lights to cast those shadows into that gutter? I can just get this with a mask. I can drop the shadow pass in there, draw the mask, and get the look I want and make sure like the pieces are going to work almost instantly. And in addition to that, even if this does animate, animating a feathered mask doesn't exactly take that long. It's a very quick way of putting shadows in very particular areas. That's, again, efficiency is king. Just a tangent on that. The reason I think so highly of efficiency, especially in a graphics pipeline, is the faster you can process ideas, the more ideas you can try. The more ideas you can try, the better your end product's going to be. Iteration is king for processing ideas. So I like to get to try stuff as quickly as possible. Cool. So we have a shadow pass increasing the gutter, and then we also have just a global shadow pass that's upping the contrast. This one is set to a soft light mode, so it actually is increasing highlights and making shadows darker instead of just being set to a multiply mode. One small thing worth noting, shadow passes out of Redshift default to being inverted. You have to invert them in After Effects. They come in backwards. So you'll get the shadows are white by default, so you got to change that. The next one is this bumps normal, and this one is a really good example of we didn't know we were going to get this information. We discovered it. So we kicked out all our AOVs, and we were going through the information stored in the AOV passes, and we were looking at this bump normal pass. And we noticed that this green highlight is sort of simulating or highlighting that for Nell. It's really calling attention to those wrinkles. And we thought that was a really cool piece of information coming out of camera angle for our bumps. And we're like, okay, let's make a mat out of this so that we can highlight these wrinkles. And again, you could position an area light in C4D to catch all these wrinkles, or you could adjust your light rig, or you can tweak it in post, fix it in post. So we did a shift channels to isolate just the green channels. We layered it in with the other blue, red, and green channels. We threw a bunch of levels on it to tweak it, and we put a glow on it to soften it. And this is actually another and here, let me just flip this on and off, and it gives you a pretty good idea of what this does. So you can just see, like right here, it adds a pretty nice highlight, and it's on a classic color dodge blending mode. I would say almost all our AOVs at some point get put in on a blending mode. I mean, it really does a nice job of amplifying those highlights. The glow in particular, so this is a glow on a black and white layer. If I was just to solo it, softens the image just a little. Let's see if I can get this. And I find when you get, particularly with AOV passes where you're pulling out particular information, sometimes they don't have the same anti-aliasing. They get a little noisy, and they get a little, or even too crisp. And we'll either throw a glow or like a 1% fast box blur just to soften the image, and it actually ends up looking a little more realistic. It's kind of like how you'd add noise to a final pass. Anyway, so and I think I did that on quite a few other layers. And actually, this isn't something that made the final cut, but I thought it'd be a good technique to show is an unsharpened mask, which I think isn't that intuitively named, but it's a pretty cool effect. So what the unsharpened mask does is it really highlights detail. So if you have like sand or rock that you want to look rougher, stronger, it pulls that out. So you can see it really amplifies like our bump map here. This particular case, we thought it was too much, but it is a really cool just compositing trick to have in your toolbox. If you get a texture back and you're like, you know what, I wish I'd bumped that a little more, just throw an unsharpened mask on it and you probably don't have to re-render. Our next pass is a shadow pass. That's actually being used as a color correction pass. So there's a tint going into this shadow pass that's making the whites orange, which is burning the scene just a little. The yellows were too yellows, and we like the more saturated orange. What this is emulating is a photo filter, which I just threw in here because this is probably a better way of showcasing this. So if I turn this on, photo filters are a really powerful compositing color correction technique. They're really good for film, particularly because they're good for incorporating CG elements into live action and blending those two together. What a photo filter does is it tints the shadows, it tints the dark parts. So you can see up here where it gets darker, we're getting a lot of blue, and here where it's white, we're getting none of the blue transfer. And you can see this, like, it's a dead giveaway in like the sci-fi original movies when the monster has like a crisp black shadow, but the shot that they shot him in, the scene, is at night, so it has cool shadows, and immediately see that little halo on him. They need to throw a photo filter on top of it to blend those together. Good rule of thumb, cooling photo filters are for night, warm photo filters are for day. Of course, you'd probably do this with some kind of subtlety, so like 25 or 15% if you actually wanted to tint it. But we felt we wanted to dial it a little in custom with the shadow. But I just think, in general, photo filters are a good way of tying all your scenes together, especially if they're from different renders where the luminance value isn't consistent across the board. Next are some reflection passes. I don't think there's any real secrets to these. This is just like there's a cool reflection. That highlight looked good. This color beam looked good from the reflections raw. We just wanted to amplify that color, so we set it into an add mode and put them in the scene. Film grain, like I said, much like blurring things and softening things, helps things look more realistic. It's a really nice technique to add a little bit of real life grit to stuff. We didn't feel like we needed it in this scene because there's enough texture detail. Film grain is one of those things, less is more. I don't really like it when you can see the grain, but I think there is a certain level of subtlety where it hits. So that's our color correction, kind of just a crash course. And if I just flip between these, you can see we just, upped the contrast, added some depth, and burnt the colors was kind of the end result. So once we get our color correction done and we kind of have our base compositing, there's a couple other steps before we get to the final. Missing frish lift, but actually I'm going to talk about frish lift, depth of field. So you can do depth of field two ways. You can do it in camera or you can do it in post. For us, we almost always have to do it in post, mainly because we have graphic elements that need to be blurred in, player photos, text. In camera looks better. It almost looks better. It just sort of almost always looks better. It just sort of ties your hands and then it's locked in that render. And frish lift does a pretty good job. So I wanted to show you just a quick compositing technique for how I use frish lift depth of field. It pulls from a depth layer, which is one of the multi-passes that it kicked out. So if I go down to this depth map, and the idea is like what's in white is in focus and what's black is out of focus, but you can pick the grayscale there. But I usually, when I spit out my depth map, I will composite this in sort of the same way I do the others. So one of my favorite things to do is to take the depth map, set it to overlay, and duplicate it on top of itself a bunch of times. And this just amps up the contrast. And one thing that's pretty interesting about this is you can see that displacement of the flag. That detail is in there, and I couldn't even see it with the naked eye. But once I really crushed it, you could do this with levels too, but this is just a really fast way of doing it. You get that contrast, and then if I go back to here, we start to get this really shallow depth of field, which is actually kind of a cool visual. I want to show you real fast how I set up depth maps because, whatever. Hopefully it's a trick that helps someone. I'll cue it up. So you can do depth passes out of Redshift. And I know I said that don't just get to Redshift and use that. I actually generate most of my depth passes from the standard render. The reason being there's actually just a little kind of some quirks with depth passes out of Redshift. I'll go over it still. So if I turn this on, and we add, helps if I'm in multipass, add depth. All right, cool. So if we render this, we'll start to get some results. So the idea with depth pass is you want to get as much information as possible where your foreground is white and your background is black and everything in between. So this worked out just because of the way the scene is set up, but if this was back here and I rendered this, nothing would show up because it's all black. So you have to define the range of the depth. And my preferred way to do that is if I create a camera, is I'll switch to a view where I can see the entire scene. And I'll come to this camera and I'll go to the details tag and I'll enable this depth of field map front blur. And this gives me visual feedback of where the black to gray is going to appear. So I'll take this point, I'll drag it to the end. I'll take this point, I'll drag it to the start, come back here and hit render. We now have a gradient. It's white to black. And that you could do that more delicate if I zoomed in. I also find this visual feedback of where my depth of field is really helps if I'm actually going to animate the depth of field. Now, you can do this in Redshift, and I'll just show this if you do want to, because there's actually some tricks to getting it to work, if you want to spit it all out at once. But if you go to the AOV manager, you can add the depth pass, and you got to change some settings by default. Come here and do Z normalized inverted. That will get you the same results as what's coming out of the picture viewer on standard. However, by default, it says use camera near far. And unfortunately, that is not this depth of field. It is the near far clipping. So you would have to set up those values here, but if you set the values here, you'll actually clip your scene and it will cut stuff off. So I just manually input it. That's a long way of saying I just turn that off and I just copy this value from here into here. But of course, the challenge with that is if you wanted to animate this, you don't have that visual feedback, you're copying values. So I really like running the depth maps out of the standard render. If I'm going to do that, there's a couple settings I like to switch. One of those is anti-aliasing to geometry. And then I just turn all this stuff off. I don't need reflections, I don't need shadows, I don't need transparency, I don't need blurriness. This will render very fast. There's 2 passes that I usually like to kick out of the standard render for a composite. That is the depth pass and the material UVW pass. Again, you can do material UVWs in Redshift. It's just significantly more complicated, and this is a very fast render. But they're really powerful passes, so they're definitely worth using. So I'm just going to go over this real quick, and I just have to do this every time. The one last thing to compositing is cryptomats, just in case there's anyone out there who isn't wise to cryptomats yet. They're the modern version of doing object buffers to get keying out. The old workflow for a cryptomat is you would put an object ID on something, assign an object ID and a tag to every individual object in your scene, and then you'd spit out a bunch of passes. Cryptomat does that all at once without having to set up any object IDs. It just spits out a mat for everything all at once, and it's wildly efficient. And they're super easy to set up. And these are Redshift only, so come to Aerial V Manager. I'll just delete these and re-add them. And go to Cryptomats, drag them in here. By default, it's going to spit out an object or a mat for every single object in the scene. I'm going to copy and paste. Yep, copy and paste this. No, I'm not. I guess I'll drag it in again. And then I'll switch this to material. And now this will spit out a different mat for every material used in my scene. So I can show you, there is a little bit of a trick to get it to work into After Effects. Let's see. I pre-render these, but this is what you'd get out. Object and material. I'll drag this material one into a scene. So you come up here, let that list populate. Drag the cryptomat onto our EXR. Cryptomats have to be EXRs. It will spit them out by default as EXRs. It gives you this color image with the cryptomat effect selected. You can just click at what you want your mat to be. And this one is the material pass, so there's actually only 2 materials in the scene. Let me do this with the object one, and we'll actually get a better look at how this behaves. And I can just, in the viewport, pick what I want to make the mat out of. I'm holding Shift to add to it. If I hold Alt, it subtracts from it. And it's just the quickest way to, in viewport, get your mats. Switch this to mat only, and now I have my mat to key stuff out. They're awesome. This is one of the best efficiency boons of all time. I'll be singing their praises forever. Cool. So that's kind of some of our compositing. But like I said, that was our compositing when we were using displacement maps. And what we ended up learning is we can't actually, some of these files have to be 60 FPS, 4K, and there's 200 different combinations. So we can't render all of those in 3D. So we had to come up with a solution of doing cloth-based displacement in After Effects that looked convincing. And our solution was UVW maps, which are really powerful and I think are going to get even more popular because there's a lot you can do with them. So what a UVW map is it spits out the UVW coordinates in a form that After Effects can understand. And actually here, let me just check. We actually had this, but I think if I come up here, this one, I think if I just click this, it will work. We had this issue earlier. Well, you'll have to forgive me. I think this red line's going to stay on our screen, but we'll still be able to see the result, so it'll still work. Okay, so what a UVW map does is it spits out UVW information that After Effects can understand. So what a UVW pass will look like is this red-green color channel mess, and what it allows you to achieve is this is the map we're putting on there. It's this outline of Mexico. Here, I'll turn this on. And it maps it to that cloth. And that image sequence causes it to move with the cloth, so it ripples with it. And you can replace this with anything. So you can see this is kind of the final output where we start to get this to look like it's displaced on that cloth by using that as a map. And it animates with it. What's really cool about UVWs is you could retexture this entire thing. I could just knock out this entire cloth texture, put a jersey mesh texture in there, and try and do some retexturing in After Effects if I want to do stuff really fast on the fly. And I'll show some of that in just a minute. But there's a couple considerations to set this up. One, UVW maps aren't a default plugin don't come standard with After Effects, as you can see by the red X. There are free solutions for UVW mapping. We chose to use Revision. It just has a few more handles. There's a couple more sliders. It gives you a little more customization. And it's pretty affordable. But there are free solutions if you want to do UVW mapping. Two, you have to set it up in Cinema. The setup in Cinema is really, really straightforward to get a UVW render. Again, if I was to come here and go to a standard render, go to multi-pass and add a UVW. That's fine. Just render without it. I don't need an output path. This is what the output is. That's it. It works. There's a couple considerations, though, I guess. You need to have at least 16-bit, but preferably 32-bit color depth. 8-bit just doesn't have enough color information to store all that UVW data in a red-white or a red-green pass. So you have to turn up the color depth. In addition to that, if you're inside of After Effects and you have a color workspace, this will break your UVW pass. So this workspace is set to none, so it's fine. But if you're working in a project that does have a color space, you can override that for just the UV pass in particular. You can do that by right-clicking, going to interpret footage main, color management, and clicking preserve RGB. Disables color management for this item. If you open a UVW pass, you start mapping stuff, and you're getting a bunch of smearing and it's looking weird, it's probably a color space issue, more times than not. So anyway, once you have this pass in, I can show you how that gets built. So we have, this is just a guide layer to show what the back composite is. This is our texture channel that's going to be put in the UVW. And then you just drop the image sequence with the UVW, and you put the remap on. Now I will say, by default, this is probably going to look something like this as soon as you drop it on. And you have to adjust, you have to go in here and tweak these settings to get the mapping you want. Because what it's doing is it's pulling from the UVWs of Cinema, which could be a lot of different things, but a really good way to clean that up would be to come into Cinema and say, map your textures on with like a linear projection, something just really flat and clean, and then it'll help this map understand it better. But either way, the settings are here to tweak that to get it centered. And then once you get it in there, I'll show you a couple of the techniques we use to generate this cloth displacement. I'll do the same thing solo up from the bottom. So first, we applied this transform effect, and I'm going to turn up the intensity on this, and this just moves it so it looks like the cloth is a little bit closer to camera. And there's actually something really cool that we do with this all the time that I've kind of made a living out of doing. So let me just show you this trick here. This transform effect is a really cool way of generating glass effects. So if I make a solid and I make it an adjustment layer, and then I throw a transform on this, and then I take the scale and I scale that up. Actually, I don't need that much. Let's do 105, and then let's throw a fast box blur on here as well. And turn that guy up. Then rotate this 45 degrees. I mean, this is sports graphics for the last 10 years, and then you can wipe across this. So it's a really, the transform effects are a really cool way of just creating a really quick refraction, like a poor man's refraction technique. But in our case, we just used it to move this texture forward. Let's set that back to default. Cool. And then we added a drop shadow, which is exactly what it is. It's just a drop shadow pulling a matte. Here you can see the same thing. We just softened the drop shadow with a box blur. It makes it a little more realistic. We then applied that transform effect to the outline. We then applied a shadow to the outline. And then we applied a bevel alpha to the outline. Bevel alpha. Composited on with an overlay mode, and it's a pretty convincing displacement. Now, of course, you could take this a step further and use it to recolor as well, which I'll show, because there's actually kind of a cool... And you can take it, again, you can take it even a lot further if you really felt like it, and you could go as far as to change the entire texture. So I'm just going to duplicate this this texture channel, and I'm going to drop this flag in here. Let's scale that up and come to this UVW map. Oh, look, it decided to read the license. Let's swap this for this one. So it's going to put this entire Mexican flag on this entire map, and you can see because of the UVWs, it will wave with the distortion. So if I come back here, I'm going to duplicate this guy and swap it for our new one. And duplicate this again and tell it to Luma matte off that. All right, cool. So we have this flag in this position. And this is another just cool, quick compositing technique that, of course, is based on blending modes, because everything I do is based on blending modes. To recolor this, I would set this mode to color. I would take this layer, the whole group, duplicate it, and then I would set this to overlay. And this overlay, this color first, then overlay, is such a good way of transferring, actually here, color to texture because it preserves most of the texture information, and it almost always works. I would tweak this red a little manually, but a cool thing about this way this UV is set up is I can come over here, wrong one, to this one, and just move that texture ever so slightly to center that crest in the image. So it's pretty easy to update, something that would normally require you to remap it in C4D. There's one thing I just want to show with that color overlay technique that I have done a million times. We work in sports graphics. We do this all the time. So I want to show you, this is a really good technique for putting field lines on grass. So I have this grass with some field lines on it. Scale this guy up. I'm going to pre-comp it to lock in the scale. And let's set that mode to color. Duplicate it. Set that mode to overlay. And that's not bad for 2 seconds. If I was really going to push this on composite, I would throw a roughen edges on it. I'm going to solo this just so I can see what I'm doing. Dial that guy way up. Take that down. Probably took that down too much. I could noodle with this forever. Okay, close enough. Copy this roughen edges. Paste down that one. Turn off the soloing. Look, is it a perfect composite of grass field lines? No. Is it pretty good for about 30 seconds? Yeah, it is. And actually, fun thing, see these blue shadows in here? That's the photo filter. So if we were going to match that, I would take this guy, duplicate it, adjustment layer, tell this to steal the alpha channel, effects, color correction, photo filter, change this to a cooling filter. And this is what I do if I was actually compositing the CG. So you can see my current cooling filter is slightly the wrong shade of blue. There's a little more turquoise. You can do custom colors, but they have a few other options here. Yeah, that one or maybe this one. Somewhere in there. And then I turn that down just to a nice subtlety. And again, is it a perfect composite? No. Is it good for 2 seconds? Yes. So color overlay is a great way of transferring images to texture. I actually think that might be about it. Did I forget anything? Let's see. No, I think that's kind of everything I wanted to show you. Oh man, that default font is not a good look for that package. Yeah, so I think that's kind of it. Hopefully there were some good compositing tricks in there, and yeah, appreciate you guys having me. I didn't give you enough a heads up.
No worries. Thank you so much for that, Eric. Some amazing tips that you've got in there, the color overlays especially. I was liking those little tricks. What is good enough for a quick 2 seconds, and how long people are going to? Well, it's not. Sometimes it's not 2 seconds. Sometimes it's 12 frames.
Mm-hmm.
So is that how you usually approach these things? About how long they're on screen, or is it how much time they take to produce?
I think you kind of nailed it, especially when we have an interstitial that's like a 3-second transition. There's motion blur, there's flares on top of it, there's, again, this doesn't quite have the fonts, but there's a lot of content on top of this. This gets pretty forgiving about what this final composite can be. So some of this is just the quick look dev that gets us there. So really it is, I would say it's more about like how long it's on the screen, what level of detail, how close the camera is to it. Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
And also there's another question that we had, which is about, in terms of compositing, how much are you kind of demonstrated the joys of doing compositing with AOVs and the amount of freedom it gives you and the time to change your mind and adapt things without having to do a re-render. But at what point do you stop thinking about the render, or when would you go back and re-render something without doing AOVs?
We try to stay with the AOVs as long as we can for look development. There's just so much fluidity there. There's client approvals, there's back and forth, and there's a lot of art direction that goes into it. Where do I draw the line? I guess it kind of depends on what, again, the final product has to be. A lot like color correction, of course, is really great for AOVs and dialing that in. But if I want a really particular shadow, a really particular highlight, at some point you just hit a threshold where the only way to actually do it is to put that area light in there and to cast the shadow on that. That being, I guess actually the trade-off would be, I even take that back. If you spent enough time with this AOV, you could probably get that highlight exactly where you wanted it. But at some point, it becomes more efficient to go into cinema and to move the light. So I guess it's just kind of knowing it's knowing the strength and limitations of the AOVs, and it's knowing the strength and limitations of the area lights. And yeah.
You made a really interesting observation about that earlier on, which is the balance of time and also what is accurate.
Mm-hmm.
And that statement that you made about the soccer ball, football, I mean, obviously, that which hasn't been the same for many, many years,
Mm-hmm.
and then the new designs are different shapes and so on. So how much of that research then do you then break with the creative treatment, or do you try and stay faithful to that all the way through?
I personally would rather have the end product look as cool as possible. So I think the faithfulness, like you definitely have to be true to the sports and true to the fans and true to the property. But also we want to make something that's cool. So I think that's a really fine line to walk. And I feel like we always, as creatives, I would rather send something out there that's cool and exciting and pushes the envelope and let people see it and digest it and start there and pull it back than stay too much in the lanes to begin with. So we definitely start big and then let the clients reel us back.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Stay cool. Show cool stuff all the time.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again for that, and thanks everyone for watching and learning all these great tips and being reminded of. I'm glad you reminded about Cryptomat as well. Because
I have to do that for the next 2 years until every artist I meet is using it.
Absolutely. And I know you mentioned at the beginning where we can get hold of you, but where should we go if we want to learn more info?
We are on the internet. Google us at Game Day Creative. We're top hit on Google.
Excellent. And of course, on 3dmotionshow.com, we have all the details and all Eric's details for all sorts of stuff. So and your contact and your where to go to and so on. So that's another place where you can go. And if you're watching this on YouTube as a recording, then check out the description because we'll have it in there as well. But anyway, thank you again.
Cool. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's great being here. Thanks.